Welcome to Historical Veracity, where history comes alive through the lens of groundbreaking research and scholarly insight. Today, we're diving into the intellectual legacy of two towering figures in biblical scholarship, Yehezkel Kaufmann and Umberto Cassuto. Join us as we unravel their contributions to our understanding of ancient texts and their enduring impact on the field. Get ready to embark on a journey through time, exploring complex theories, challenging preconceived notions and discovering the roots of biblical history. This is Historical Veracity, where truth meets history. On the biblical scholars, Yehezkel Kaufmann and Umberto Cassuto. It is appropriate to dedicate a chapter to the conclusions of Yehezkel Kaufmann from his extensive work, particularly because of his defense of the historical tradition. After brilliantly debunking the entire structure of biblical criticism and proving the exact historical order of the events described in the Bible, he returns to the starting point of criticism. Interestingly, when it comes to the most significant conclusions, he uses the methods of criticism, the same methods he rejects throughout his work, and the work beneath the surface, the denial of the Torah's true meaning, the history as simply as it is described in the 5 books of Moses, he does with a kind of sophisticated simplicity in an ancient manner. Kaufmann declares in his introduction, several great laws of criticism have been acknowledged as having been disproven, such as the identification of the Torah's 3 primary sources. However, he also acknowledges several great assumptions of criticism that not only have not been disproven but also have not been examined or discussed. Was the Torah indeed given at Sinai? The complete disregard for the period of the Exodus from Egypt, despite acknowledging the antiquity and correctness of Israeli history even before the descent to Egypt, is unexplained. Kaufmann dismisses all events of the Exodus as legend. But what is the reality behind this legend? Did the miracle from the critique come about this as well? Where has the precise critical sense that distinguishes between facts and speculations and husks disappeared to? Does an event like the Exodus, wandering in the desert, and the conquest of the land not demand a real explanation, according to Kaufmann? How can we believe that the compositions preceding the descent to Egypt, originating close to the sons of Jacob themselves and passed through the hands of Moses the prophet, surely the people believed that these words were given at Sinai by God, were not sanctified in their letters until the end of the days of the first temple, and all that is told in them is just legends? Kaufmann's incomprehensible entanglement with the national creation, the power and the spirit that create, one of the eternal riddles of being, which in any case there is no miraculous event or one that is out of the natural order, the circling around a marvelous intuition and an ancient taboo does not solve historical questions. He attributes Judaism to the creative power of the people, but he himself proves from history that before the Exodus and the bush legends, the marvelous monotheism did not exist, and from that generation onwards it existed in all its intensity and branches. He proves that there was no war on idolatry from the lack of hints. And here too, in the period that he believes idolatry was rampant, there are no hints of such a war. The only hint is the giving of the Torah, which Kaufmann does not believe in. He attributes the creation to the prophet the messenger, to the genius of the prophet. But it never occurred to anyone that one man at one time could have conceived of this great Torah that the 24 books of the Bible barely contain. And thousands of years of the world are nourished from it. And despite all this, there is no hint or memory in the Torah of an event related to the formation or domination of monotheism. All his circlings and entanglements with the sheepishness of national creation are devoid of content. The entire people, out of pure faith and out of a correct sense and correct intuition. Revolutions like these do not happen without intention from the senses. Intuition comes after the facts and does not generate unequivocal and comprehensive revolutions like these.
In his books, the possibility of writing the Torah, or at least most of it, in the desert is not examined at all in Chapter A, page 20. He donates a few sentences in favor of the acknowledged knowledge that the book of the Torah was sealed, sanctified, and accepted by the entire nation was not in the days of the first temple. because the Torah is composed of three primary sources, so different from each other in their style and content, proves that the book of the Torah was preceded by a long period of Torah literature. But there is no solution in the formulation Torah literature as explained in its place, and there is no proof of its existence and its time. Of course, the possibility of the truth of the tradition regarding divine revelation and such was not examined, nor was the possibility of the existence of a tradition that has no proof on it. He talks about three parallel Torahs, but does not take even one step in researching the relationship of the people to the laws of those Torahs. How did they behave with three contradicting Torahs? Where did three Torahs come from? How and where did they exist? He believes in the reality of laws and deeds even before the Exodus, but he does not believe in any canonization until Ezra the scribe. How did those wandering literature clumps and portable paragraph bundles survive for hundreds of years as a unique phenomenon in history? It is worth seeing his critique of Runkay that there is a resemblance between his view and the view that motivates this. But Runkay accepts the Jewish tradition as it is as a historical tradition in all its details, and does not refrain from also adding to it the legend of the sages, a note on page 12. R&K, who is the first of the enlighteners who thought that there are foreign and mistaken legends in the Gemara, and we should only accept those that seem right to us, sinned in that he did not refrain from adding the legend of the sages. And Cassuto beautifully wrote in his introduction that in his research he will also use the legends of the sages, even though they were written in a later time. There are elements of ancient days in them. Kaufmann himself sins in this sin, and his declarations are but a cover. Later, Kaufmann replaces the definition of Runkay, who believed in the initial revelation of the absolute spiritual, and interpreted the development as only a socially influential one, to an intuitive spark. It is clear that if we accept prophecy as a real phenomenon, then without a doubt it has contact with the truth, the abstract spiritual. And in general, any of the researchers who dared to rely on the biblical chronology as it is, immediately receives from Kaufmann a critique on the very attempt because of several so what questions. It is enough to note the fact that many books dealt with the dating possibilities according to the tradition, and there is no contradiction in these explanations or a deviation from the simple, clearly the opinion of the tradition. The Bible is not entitled to be a reliable source of times. It is nothing but a creation with a correct sense and a true inner feeling. From here to seeing it as history in Kaufmann's eyes, the way is long. And in this and the like, he is still bound by the chains of criticism and its early assumptions. It is also interesting to see his critique of R.D.Z. Hoffmann. Hoffmann, who preceded Kaufmann in the main matters, is mentioned in Kaufmann's book only once, in a footnote on page 114. He indeed admits there that Hoffmann felt with an amazingly correct critical sense that the hypothesis of Graf Wellhausen was absolutely shattered by these three laws of SK: the law of Passover, Exodus 12, the law of slaughtering of Chulin, Leviticus 17, and the law of tithe, Leviticus 27. But Hoffmann's harmonistic explanations do not stand either before the critique. In this definition of not standing before the critique, Kaufmann settled to kill all of Hoffmann's work and leave him a correct critical sense only, as a way that he leaves the entire creation of the Bible to the correct intuition. This harsh sentence of Kaufmann found its place in the encyclopedia entry Torah. Already in the days of Wellhausen, D.Z. Hoffmann went out to attack his method. Despite Hoffmann's harmonistic approach, his critique strikes at the core of the hypothesis of the Wellhausen school regarding the development of worship, p. 500. But the critical method of Kaufmann and his students is no less harmonistic, since it adapts all the data to the fundamental assumptions of the critique. Adherence to a historical document is not harmonization, and adherence to an ideological dogma is a striking harmonization. Every scientific theory and its confirmations are certainly harmonization. Kaufmann explains all the laws of the Torah as laws based on belief in demons and spirits. He explains how the Torah changed the laws on their face and poured new content into them, but he does not know what the content is. All the laws for him are secondary belief. He does not have the possibility of a moral explanation for any law. The belief that could have turned the world and its fullness could not get rid of a few unnecessary laws, and moreover added to them many tens and hundreds of its own. All that remains of the Torah is the numerous commandments in all their parts and details. The morality and reproofs of the prophets and the Torah are not relevant to our generation. The most eternal thing in the Torah, the laws, do not receive attribution from Kaufmann. They are not related to the power and the creative spirit of the nation. And in chapter A, page 664, Kaufmann writes that it is only by chance that the sacrifice was not rejected as the ways of the Amorite, and how much lack of appreciation and understanding there is in this empty sentence. The sacrifice, which is one of the foundations of Judaism and occupies most of the laws of the Torah, entered into Judaism by accident. No wonder that elsewhere he says the question whether the prophets opposed sacrifices in general we can leave in need of examination. Today this view is not accepted, and therefore it is a pity to elaborate and explain how explicit verses contradict it. The sinew of the hip he sees as carrying harmful magical power, page 545. But if he admits the existence of a tradition about Jacob's injury, etc., why can it not be interpreted as a memory of this act? It is just that he too entered himself into the template of development, according to which symbolic acts like these, disconnected from all magic, have not yet been created. On page 58, he diagnoses the book of Deuteronomy, in which only the death penalty of stoning is mentioned, in contrast to Numbers, where the death penalty of stabbing is also mentioned. Where? In the context of state execution, the matter is similar to the diagnosis of the Book of Numbers, where the death penalty of being swallowed by the earth is mentioned, Korat, and Leviticus, where the death penalty of approaching before the Lord is mentioned, the Book of Exodus, where the death penalty of being thrown into the sea is mentioned, and the Book of Genesis, where the death penalty of birds pecking above his head is mentioned, the dream of the chief baker. The punishment of lashes is mentioned only in D, so what? On page 451 he writes, "We cannot fit the pictures we find in the Bible about the danger of approaching God and all that is holy to God to the belief in a supreme moral will. It is hard to understand how he dares to be the judge of what is a divine moral will and what cannot be a supreme moral will. But it is about a known danger that the person must beware of, and it is no less moral than hanging high voltage cables. Further proofs of Kaufmann against the morality according to the prophecy, the polishing of Agag before the Lord. Interesting what his opinion is on the hanging of Eichmann. Yes, he proves from the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, but maybe it's because he doesn't accept the story of the enslavement and torment of the Israelites, including throwing the newborn son into the Nile. The hardening of his heart was just a technical trick to bring him to the bench of the punished. Another injustice, Moses impales the heads of the people to the Lord, but the heads of the people also sinned, and here Kaufmann already opposes the death penalty. Also, the binding of Isaac he counts as opposed to morality. While it is one of the most marvelous enlightenments in the history of the world, symbolizing the God who teaches his creatures the value of the sanctity of human life in the negative way. On page 453, he finds an internal contradiction in the verse, "And you have made their hearts backward. How can God lead to sin?" When it is clear to every reader that the intention is that God did not show his might and his power and thereby allowed the people to go after the Baal. It is hard to estimate how much superficiality and frivolity there is in such an empty analysis of all the principles of philosophy and thought. The priesthood. He finds a significant contradiction between Numbers 25:13, which grants the priesthood to Phinehas due to his actions as if it had not already been given to Aaron. But was it given to Aaron and his descendants forever? We only recognize this self-evident reality after the act of Phinehas. From Samuel 2, it appears that only Eli's house was eligible for the priesthood, since it mentions that they had served as priests since Egypt. He also knows that a Levite becomes a priest not automatically, but only through the filling of hands, ordination. He Judges 17:12, 1 Kings 12:31. But how did he forget that filling of hands is mentioned in Leviticus 21, the high priest among his brothers, upon whose head the anointing oil was poured, and who has been ordained to wear the garments, which is a consecration for the high priest, and possibly in a similar manner, the priest was consecrated to become the chief priest at Micah's idol shrine. In Kings it is only mentioned that Jeroboam made priests from the outskirts of the land who were not from the Levites. And what relevance does this have to our discussion? Another piece of information he has is, the kings of David's house always served as priests, at least until Hezekiah, but where is this information from? We only heard about David's sons serving as priests before the establishment of the temple, and about Uzziah who became leprous. Perhaps from the story of Korah, we should learn that the Levites were priests, and from the story of Zimri and the Midianite woman, should we learn that the princes in Israel used to stay with consecrated women? And from the act of Joseph that Jews were accustomed to selling their brothers? Kaufmann also occasionally uses, like other researchers, different foundations that are not based on the Torah. In his commentary on Judges 19, he knows that there is no basis in the Torah for the punishments imposed on the hill of Benjamin in the incident of the concubine. There is no basis for preventing marriage with Benjamin. Benjamin's sin was that it sheltered the sinners and broke the tribal covenant. This sin is not mentioned in the Torah, let alone the punishment of total ban, killing of men, women and children, and burning of the city. Yet this claim is similar to Berkeley's claim that the king's right to collect taxes came from a secular statute. Does this right need a statute? The king's very monarchy implies the collection of taxes and so on. The non-marriage with Benjamin is not a ceremonial punishment, but a consequence of the tribe's sin and its refusal to repent. It is not related to the tribal covenant, but to the sin and abomination committed in Benjamin, as stated in the Torah, "Turn away from the tents of these wicked men." A total ban on a sinful city and burning it is mentioned in the Torah in the section of the Ayah Hanidachat. Cassuto in Exodus p. 181 repeats these weak proofs unconvincingly, such as the addition of the proof from Isaiah 10, "One woe to those who decree iniquitous decrees and the writers who keep writing oppression," that this is certainly a secular legislation, or proofs from the era of the wicked kings who certainly did not honor the laws of the Torah. Kaufmann invented a theory that the Levites were expelled from the priesthood by war, and a reminder of this is in the Act of Korah, but he does not attempt to bring evidence for this theory. So what need is there for the Act of Korah if we can invent history ourselves? He desperately tangles with "he did not know his brother," while the verse explicitly states that the tribe of Levi killed a man among his brothers. But since the song is certainly ancient, in his opinion, and the Act of Korah did not add personal acceptance for the distinctions Kaufmann created, he had to abandon it. The fathers and the tribes. Kaufmann found a fact that contradicts the general biblical distinction, referring to an ancient inscription indicating a group called Benjamin in Haran, more precisely, the sons of Yamina, proving that the tribe of Benjamin existed already in the time of Abraham. Is this science? It only teaches that the name Benjamin is of Haranian origin, which fits well with the story of Rachel from Haran naming her son Benjamin upon entering the land. Consider for yourselves, had the Torah mentioned a tribe named Benjamin in the land of Haran, like many other comparisons and parallels in the names in the Torah, there would be no discovery or surprise here, and certainly no internal contradiction in the biblical distinction, but just another coincidence with a common cause. The compelling proof of Kaufmann that the patriarchs were not truly monotheists is that in the Torah, Adam, Seth and Enosh are also presented as monotheists, and as it was not so, it was not. But here we come again to the foundation of faith. If the initial assumption that what is implied by the Torah, that God revealed himself to humans and announced that he created the world, cannot be correct, is there a discussion here? Also, in the era of the patriarchs, the writing of history is from the Israeli perspective of a covenant with God that shapes the nation's course. And how are all these events preserved if their preservation purpose is monotheism? See in the Biblical Encyclopedia the entry on Patriarchs p. 12. It is clear that the religious perception in the stories of the patriarchs is monotheistic and not different from the perception of Judaism. Although it was established even before the event of Mount Sinai in general, how did Israel survive as a nation for hundreds of years in oppressive Egypt, if not for being a people with a single idea? If the patriarchs were idolaters, then Judaism would not preserve the tradition about them at all, but rather, on the contrary, deny and condemn them. As Joshua son of Nun recounts about Terah, the father of Abraham, an idolater, 24:2, they would tell about Abraham himself. On the antiquity of monotheism and its roots, see in the book Judaism and Modern Life, Chapter 4. And so the book of Job, based on an act that does not occur in Israel and not among the Israelites. Yet they know the one God alone. This assumption is agreed upon in research that the story of Job does not originate in Israel and probably in Edom during the Exodus period. Encyclopedia Biblica, entry on Job. According to him, the story in Genesis 33:18 that Jacob bought the piece of land where he pitched his tent for 100 pieces of silver is a parallel to the story in Genesis 23 of Abraham and the cave of Machpelah. What miracle came upon this scientific determination? And perhaps Job 42:11 is another version of this event. Yehezkel Kaufmann attacks the prophet Ezekiel very harshly. This is yet another of the oddities of this strange prophet. He says about him, and in his place he elaborates and brings many claims against him. For example, the ancient imagery of mourning is reflected in him through a distorted mirror. We will not enter these discussions here, which again touch on the foundations of Jewish thought. But as an example, a claim accusing Ezekiel of distorting history when he says about the Israelites in the desert, "They also greatly desecrated my Sabbaths," since there is no mention of this in the Torah. But how do we know there wasn't such a tradition? It's possible, according to Kaufmann, that they were not commanded about the Sabbath in the desert, and therefore he does not accept the words of the prophet. But clearly, Ezekiel's intent is to the act of the wood-gatherer, and when he enumerates the nation's testimonies in order, he can say in plural, "They also greatly desecrated my Sabbaths," meaning they even reached the desecration of the Sabbath.
Especially since this is the style of the prophets as known, just as in Joshua it is defined that Achan's taking from the ban, Israel has sinned, and they have also transgressed my covenant that I commanded them. And they have also taken of the ban, and have also stolen and also dissembled, and they have also put it among their own stuff. And the children of Israel could not stand before their enemies. They turned their backs before their enemies, because they were made a ban. I will no longer be with you unless you destroy the ban from among you. Here too, one person took from the ban. When he denies, he clings to weak questions. In the chapter on Hosea, for example, Vol 6, p. 94, he invents from his heart two Hoseas, based on his distinctions that are good in general and not in particular. In the first part of Hosea, the image of God's covenant with his people is of lover's love. In the first part, there is no mention of moral corruption. In the second part, there is no mention of Baal worship in the present. The prevention of yield, which is the main punishment in chapter 2, is mentioned in chapter 4 only as an afterthought. So what? And how does Hosea accuse Israel of Baal worship in the multitude of revelers when Jehu eradicated the Baal? Isn't it possible that some remnants in this or that city gathered for this purpose, or is he mentioning past sins? As he can mention the war of the concubine in Gibeah. Kaufmann, Vol 1, p. 647, denies the act of the oath to the Gibeonites, because in the days of Samuel the Gibeonites are not mentioned as enslaved, but by the days of Samuel the tabernacle of Shiloh had already been destroyed, and they were enslaved only to the tabernacle. The mention of the Gibeonites in Gibeon in Joshua 10 teaches nothing. Clearly, the Gibeonites lived in their cities since they established families, etc. Even if the arrangement of their enslavement began, then it does not negate them from having a normal lifestyle. And Joshua's rescue of them only proves that there was some special covenant between them. In any case, even if their enslavement was not maintained at all, does it prove that such a decision was never made? Also, regarding the laws of the Torah, we found that they were transgressed. Either way, Kaufmann himself admits that the Gibeonites are the only ones who survived among the Canaanites and were accepted as having rights in Israel. What then is the reason for this? His note, p. 658, that the ban did not initially include all the Canaanite cities, based on the uniqueness of the story of Jericho, is tasteless. Jericho was also banned in its reconstruction and also in the prohibition of benefiting from its loot. There we also learn the lesson of violating the ban, Achan, besides the fact that it was the first city conquered, and moreover in such a miraculous way. There's no wonder in its uniqueness. There is only proof that the commandment of the ban was practiced from the very first city.
Kaufmann's exploration of biblical texts evolves significantly across his work, showing a shift from initial assumptions towards a more nuanced analysis. Initially aligning with critical perspectives, he progressively questions these stances, particularly evident in his reconsideration of themes like the unity of worship from Deuteronomy to Kings II and the nature of the former prophets. His early certainty about connections between biblical figures and historical or theological concepts, such as linking the scepter shall not depart from Judah to King David, or interpreting the role of the Philistines, evolves into more critical re-evaluations in later volumes. Kaufmann also critiques other scholars for their interpretations and methodological approaches, like Gassman's assertion about Samuel's priestly role, highlighting his shift towards questioning established views. His journey through the volumes illustrates a departure from the critical template he initially engaged with, suggesting a path towards freeing himself from these early critiques if given more time. Furthermore, Kaufmann addresses discrepancies in scholarly interpretations about biblical narratives, such as the sin of the golden calf and the sacrificial practices in ancient Israel, advocating for a contextual understanding. He challenges the consistency of critical scholarship, particularly when it detaches stories from their contexts or overlooks contradictions within the biblical text and historical traditions. This evolution in Kaufmann's thought process underscores a gradual liberation from initial critical assumptions and a move towards a deeper, more reflective engagement with the biblical text, emphasizing the complexity of historical and theological analysis. The archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon describes the fall of Jericho's walls in an unnatural way, attributing it to an earthquake that occurred after the 7 days of Joshua's army's encirclement. Kaufmann, on the other hand, questions the dating of the wall's fall due to a catastrophe, suggesting that the walls fell outward, possibly due to an earthquake. He raises the question of whether the Israelites conquered the city exactly when an earthquake brought down the walls, implying that it might have been an unnatural coincidence. Moving on to the splitting of the Red Sea, Kaufmann finds a logical explanation for how the Israelites crossed when the pursuers were swept away by water flow. He questions whether it was mere chance that the Israelites escaped when there was a passage and their pursuers were swept away. Another perspective offered by Yehezkel suggests that the loss of Heel's sons could be seen as the fulfillment of Joshua's curse on Jericho, preventing its rebuilding. This interpretation highlights how popular belief perceived the deaths of Heel's sons as a sign of the curse's effectiveness, even though they may have been coincidental occurrences. In examining the ancient texts and stories, Kaufmann's focus on refuting critiques does not delve deeply into questioning whether the Bible's narratives can be accepted as historical events. The proofs of its compilation and existence throughout history raise important questions about the credibility of these accounts. Cassuto. It's interesting because Kaufmann's method is the complete opposite of Cassuto's method. Kaufmann's power is only in his words. With brilliance and spectacular mathematics, he refutes the structures of the critique without leaving any other way, and with mocking versification, he rhymes the research dreams one after the other. All this comes only from the revolt against the injustice done to the Jewish people. In the distorted perception of the critique, his work is the history of the Israeli faith, and not by accident the people are mentioned here and not the Torah. He does not agree to present the people as small-minded, weak-willed, and so on. From this, he attacked the theories of the critique, one by one, but any theory that did not come against it with the mathematical and clear method he uses deserves to be accepted. And the value of the Torah, linguistic corruptions that occurred in it, contradictions and duplications and lack of precision, or the exact time of its composition that he attributes to himself, is not an important issue. This is precisely because of the mathematical value of the critical style distinctions. Therefore, he also narrows them down and sets them to a level that suffices to calculate them with mathematical tools. Cassuto does not invest his main effort, but in the Torah, its precision and the depth found in it. Cassuto drew the spirit of ancient literature in his work on it extensively, and by this he managed to penetrate the layer of writing in ancient literatures. He invested mainly in the correct and true interpretation, its foundation and explanation, instead of refuting the interpretations that are not such, which he saw as crumbling by themselves compared to the correct interpretation. He wasn't at all bothered to think about discovering epics and poor songs that constituted the history of the Israeli faith. The main thing is the Torah, its accuracy and the depth it contains. Cassuto drank the literature of ancient times in his extensive engagement with it, and thereby succeeded in penetrating the writing layer in ancient literatures. He invested mainly in the correct and true explanation, its foundation and explanation, rather than refuting explanations that are not such, which he saw as naturally crumbling compared to the correct interpretation. He wasn't at all bothered to think about discovering epics and poor songs that constituted the history of the Israeli faith. The main thing is the Torah, its accuracy and the depth it contains. Cassuto was anxious and feared for every word and sentence in the Torah, attributing infinite depth and significance to the Torah. The image of the next generation's biblical interpretation hovers before his eyes. And even before he knows exactly how this image will emerge, he declares it in his book, The Documentary Hypothesis. Out of sheer concern for the Torah in all his writings, he never agreed, not even in one place, to amend a single letter in the Torah. Due to the sanctity of the subject, he also does not want to touch in all his Hebrew writings the question of when the Torah was compiled. But this does not prevent him from basing, for example, his main explanations on the fact that Israel drew a lot from Canaanite culture and poetry, something that is completely contrary to the explicit narrative of the early prophets, and Kaufmann has already proved in his work that was before Cassuto's eyes, even before his writings, in a decisive manner that does not allow two interpretations, that there was no Canaanite influence on Israel, but the Canaanite was banned and destroyed. And of course, this explanation contradicts the Torah's narrative that was written by Moses before encountering the land of Canaan. Perhaps he meant the Canaanite inhabitant of the land during the time of the patriarchs, but even this contradicts what is narrated in the Torah. And here is the place to mention what Velikovsky already showed, that the entire dating of the Ugaritic text to the 15th century BCE relies on a hypothesis, and it seems more likely that they belong to the 10th century and onwards and are under Hebrew influence, as we found in the kingdoms in the region. See Encyclopedia of the Ancient World, Entry Aram. For Cassuto, the main thing is the Torah, its accuracy, and the depth it contains. Cassuto was anxious and fearful for every word and sentence in the Torah, attributing infinite depth and significance to the Torah. The image of the next generation's biblical interpretation hovers before his eyes. And even before he knows exactly how this image will emerge, he declares it in his book, The Documentary Hypothesis. Out of sheer concern for the Torah in all his writings, he never agreed, not even in one place, to amend a single letter in the Torah. Due to the sanctity of the subject, he also does not want to touch in all his Hebrew writings the question of when the Torah was compiled, but this does not prevent him from basing, for example, his main explanations on the fact that Israel drew a lot from Canaanite culture and poetry, something that is completely contrary to the explicit narrative of the early prophets. And Kaufmann has already proved in his work that was before Cassuto's eyes, even before his writings, in a decisive manner that does not allow two interpretations, that there was no Canaanite influence on Israel, but the Canaanite was banned and destroyed. And of course, this explanation contradicts the Torah's narrative that was written by Moses before encountering the land of Canaan. Perhaps he meant the Canaanite inhabitant of the land during the time of the patriarchs, but even this contradicts what is narrated in the Torah. And here is the place to mention what Velikovsky already showed, that the entire dating of the Ugaritic text to the 15th century BCE relies on a hypothesis, and it seems more likely that they belong to the 10th century and onwards and are under Hebrew influence, as we found in the kingdoms in the region. See Encyclopedia of the Ancient World, Entry Aram. No doubt, these two enterprises contributed a lot to the understanding of the truth about the Bible, and influenced more than any other research on the accepted perception in Israel. Most scholars in the generation after them were influenced to some extent by their words, especially Cassuto's students such as Hartum, Greenitz, and many others, but no one arose and drew conclusions. All that happened was an improvement in the approach to the Bible. Thank you for joining us on this enlightening exploration of Yehezkel Kaufmann and Umberto Cassuto's groundbreaking work in biblical scholarship. Their legacy is a testament to the power of critical thinking and the pursuit of truth in historical studies. If you're fascinated by the mysteries of the past and the scholars who dedicate their lives to uncovering them, don't forget to subscribe to Historical Veracity. Like and share this video to help spread the knowledge, and comment below with your thoughts or questions. Stay curious, keep questioning, and never stop exploring. Until next time, this is Historical Veracity signing off.